Hi, welcome to Making Sense of Complexity, featuring conversations with complexity science practitioners and philosophers. Our goal is to share insights on how to make sense of our complex and uncertain world. Today our guest is Michael Garfield, the host of the Santa Fe Institute's Complexity podcast, some 84 episodes featuring conversations with some of the world's smartest and most interesting complexity scientists. Michael is also an artist, musician, writer, editor, organizer, and cultural change agent. Let's begin. Michael Garfield, it's nice to see you.
Thanks, likewise.
Yeah, thanks for joining me on this episode of Making Sense of Complexity. First of all, where are you calling in from, and what's the weather like there?
We're in Santa Fe, New Mexico, me and my wife and kids, and cat and turtles, and a bonsai I'm afraid my friend killed while we were away on vacation last week. And weather here is drought. Things are reasonably green, all things considered, but we haven't had rain in quite a while. And, anybody who's been following national news knows that we've had the biggest forest fire in New Mexico history this year, one of two that were bracing Santa Fe on either side. And that's been real sad. I'm sure people living in, much of the rest of the world are already sort of familiar with this type of tragedy, but it's... I've had friends lose their homes this year, and apparently the bigger of the two fires was started by some foolish Forestry Service person doing a controlled burn out of season. I don't know how someone from Oregon was responsible for a controlled burn in New Mexico, but apparently they were not aware that this time of year is incredibly windy. And so they started a fire that just took off.
Yeah. Well, are those other conditions normal for Arizona at this time of year, or New Mexico, or is it?
March and April tend to be very, very windy.
Yeah.
That's not unusual.
But you would hope with a little bit of the snow there'd be some moisture kind of hold down the.
There wasn't a lot of snow this year.
Yeah.
Is the thing. That's sort of what controls. What determines summer precipitation and.
Yeah.
And so, this is sort of just one of those things about, if we want to just jump right into complex systems kind of thinking about this, like that's the classic problem of whatever made it more efficient in someone's eyes to outsource forest management out of state and bring someone in with no local knowledge of this place to perform a high stakes operation like a controlled burn. It's clear that on the time scale that actually matters for these kinds of determinations, that was a terrible idea. So you have the same kind of this constant clash between sort of individual and institutional, or local, regional, and global concerns, the short term and the long term horizons. And hopefully this got through to people that they need to think differently about how these things are regulated. But anyway,
So that's one example of the title is Making Sense. So one of the ways that people make sense is to follow a set of rules or instructions that are fixed and determinate, and think that they apply to all things that they don't apply to. There's a better way from thinking about it from a complexity, dynamic system standpoint, to think about things as more open and not necessarily amenable to dogmatic kinds of approaches or hierarchical or fixed process approaches. You really do need that local knowledge and the actual knowledge of what system you're dealing with in order to be able to make better predictions. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, that's like Nora Bateson talks a lot about warm data, which is a kind of a similar notion. That the model is never, it's the map and territory kind of
Yeah.
tension, and that your models are never adequate on some level. And I love getting into it with her about this, because obviously like the model is really in some way the best we're ever going to get. And the model is not a fixed object. It's an evolutionary product, and it's constantly adapting. Unless it's not. I mean, you and I, before we started this call, talked about the latest episode that I did of Future Fossils 186, where I was objecting to the commonly held conviction among very intelligent people that there are certain questions that are not sort of fit for scientific inquiry. Weird things that people are quick to dismiss in order to patrol the perimeter of some kind of belief system that is not in itself actually scientific, and that science is really borderless as far as what is worthy as an object of rigorous scrutiny. But we all have real limits to our attention and to our resources that can be brought to bear on things. And so there's a sense in which all of us, no matter how well intended, do foreclose upon certain lines of inquiry simply because we confuse not having the time or the interest with to study a particular thing with it not being worthy of study. Mm-hmm. But at any rate,
yeah. And so the Forest Service, they have a particular way of looking at things, and they follow the things that make sense to them, but it misses the mark on some occasions. And just like there are scientists in the in the world of physics or cosmology or biology that get certain fixed notions that they feel are the right answer, and then they're going to dismiss the things that aren't consistent with that. So that tends to narrow down. So that's a process of dogmatization. That's a funny word. That really applies to doesn't it apply to all aspects of human endeavor? We want an answer, we want a fixed answer, and so we lay it on the guardrails. It says it has to be this way.
Yeah, and that's forgivable, I think, on some level. I mean, at the level that each of us individually have to close the books on something. But like this is where the tension lies, and the tragedy of all of this lies. I had my car totaled in a hit and run last year, and my daughter and I were nearly killed. Luckily, we walked away from this wreck reasonably unscathed, but the police on site responding to this wreck were very eager to find the perp that just drove away from the crime scene. And somehow a friend of ours managed to get a photograph of the car as it was driving away with a mostly identifiable license plate. And we gave this photo to the police, and nothing ever came from it. And it's like, look, I know you guys are dealing with gang violence and homicides and so on, but like, it's not a big city. We're talking, this is a city of 80,000 people. There are probably 30 or 40 vehicles of this description on record, and of them, only maybe 2 with the same 3 identifiable numbers. I mean, this is not a hard thing to find. And, this is sort of related to perhaps issues of the Great Resignation, that, people just walking away from their jobs during and after, the crest of the COVID pandemic. And it's certainly something that I feel at work with working for a small nonprofit that's, chronically dealing with what Doug Rushkoff called present shock, which was a big inspiration for me in my thinking and my podcasting, where, you're just assailed by competing demands for your attention. But the point is that, that how an organization or a state or a marketplace determines what's valuable, and how people determine what's valuable is constantly at odds. These two things are always at odds with each other. And so, there's this this notion of coarse graining, right? Of the resolution at which a system is aware of its various interacting components at the micro scale. So we think of ourselves as like, composed of organs and tissues and so on, and so we're happy to like blow out our gastrointestinal flora with antibiotics in order to rid ourselves of a disease, and not at all or amputate something, and then that's it's only viable due to the sort of willful ignorance that we have with respect to the cells. So each of us being like cells in the body of something, we're constantly falling through the cracks. Anyway, end rant.
Yeah. So let me back that up and say, is there a better way? If we have this sense that we like simple answers, we take a fixed answer and we'll run with it, but that's not always the best answer, because sometimes we're ignoring stuff, sometimes we're putting the blinders on, sometimes we're not relating to the environment based upon the actual information coming in, so how does a complex adaptive system do a better job at making the right choices?
I'm not sure that we can. There's iterative incremental improvement of the ways that we gather information, the ways that we act on that information, but there's no getting around, like this whole thing about big data and the desire of people in working in tech now to create a sort of one-to-one model of reality. For people who've seen, who have read Borges or saw the third season of Westworld or work at Google, these people that are aware of this sort of moonshot project to create a digital twin of our planet. And of course, in so doing, this is a big problem that I talk about a lot on Complexity and on Future Fossils, the problem of not knowing how to render all value with economic models, not knowing when we're trying to establish the value of an acre of rainforest, and not knowing actually all of the relationships between the organisms in that acre and between them and everything else in the world. And so we put a money value on that acre, and then 20 years later the science changes and we realize that we had that there was invisible labor going on, that we were leaving all of the, but of course, like, you try to chase that and it's a sort of you swallow the spider to catch the fly thing, and eventually the attempting to make a more and more complete model of the world means that the computational and energetic resources required in such an effort end up undermining the systems you're trying to study. Like you can't do it.
There's the saying about perfection is the enemy of the good.
Right.
You just can't. You could chase down those rabbit holes forever, and you could never get the final answer. So you have to make approximations. You have to make guesses. You have to use heuristics. Some kind of process of trying to make sense of the things that are disparate and all over the map, and you just sort of have to kind of narrow that down. But the point I'm trying to make is you don't want to do that with just a dogmatic response that says, oh, hell with it, we're just going to do this, and this is what I want to do. I can't make sense of this stuff that's going on, so I'm just going to buy into this and forget about all the rest of it, which is what humans have a tendency to do. But if we want to come to a better place of making sense so that we can make better decisions, what are some of the things that we need to really pay attention to? Okay,
being open to the fact that, okay, we don't know the answers, right? So that's one thing. We have to be open to the possibilities. We have to watch out for those dogmatic tendencies to insert themselves so that we think we know when we really don't know, right? So that's openness and avoiding that dogma. So, a little bit of doubt about our own convictions is useful, but we don't want to layer into skepticism or, denial or just rejecting things that might seem like fringes, but, could have some validity to them. Right? Does that make sense? To sort of take those principles in and, help it to shape the way we deal with these uncertainties and the fact that we can't know everything?
I mean, skepticism in its original sense. My friends who host the Weird Studies podcast had a great rant on this a while back. Skepticism in the way that people tend to talk about it now is roughly synonymous with denial. But skepticism as it was originally articulated means something more like the doubt of Zen. It's more like what you're talking about, that a sense of a commitment to not prematurely closing on a question. And of course, just to play, sympathy for the devil here, I really do have a lot of compassion, I guess, for the need for people to act on an understanding, whether or not that understanding is assumed final. We're in a sticky situation here as a species now, where we're dealing with most of the problems that really matter to us at a civilizational scale are too complex to be properly understood by us, and yet we have to do something, and we have to do something relatively soon. And so, this is we're on a kind of a crisis footing with all of this stuff, like global warming, or the deforestation, or the control of
big data,
pandemics, high frequency trading algorithms and interlocked banks, and these cascading failures that happen due to small, almost immeasurably small, failures,
lack of resilience.
And so it's how do you have to, I think that, ultimately, I wrote a science fiction story a few years ago called An Oral History of the End of Reality that was about the epistemic shock to society due to deepfakes. And just this question of what happens when we lose this naive confidence in the veracity of our recordings. What happens when we can no longer trust our eyes and ears, and the forensics is sort of locked in this losing arms race against counterfeiting. And what I came to was that with any luck, we emerge from this crisis as better scientists, that we become much more comfortable with uncertainty, and we become much more comfortable articulating ourselves, our positions in terms of confidence intervals. You can probably hear my kid crying across the room here. I'll just give it a second.
Speaking of confidence intervals or uncertainties or unpredictabilities,
Right. Always.
I made the point to somebody that children are the ultimate complex adaptive system, because they're unpredictable and they're adaptive from moment to moment, and it's a great lesson for people to see the vagaries, the uncertainties, and also the beauty and the joy that happens instantaneously.
Yeah, you definitely get a sense for just how, it's sort of like the way that my buddy Mark Nelson, who was one of the 8 people locked inside Biosphere 2 back in the 90s for 2 years, when they were trying to simulate the whole biosphere inside this building in Arizona, and he said, you could see right away how, for instance, accidentally misthreading a glue bottle would show up in their atmospheric readers inside the building. You'd see that the things were out of balance. You'd see these microscopic changes that would magnify just due to the size of the system in miniature. And so, they had a spike in CO2 at one point that forced them to open the building to the atmosphere so that they didn't all suffocate to death.
Yeah.
And, and so they were able to achieve a runaway greenhouse scenario in under 2 years just because this atmosphere was so small. Mm-hmm. And there's something like that with the kids, right? Which is that the rate at which they move through their emotional repertoire is so much faster than it is with adults. Talk about scaling laws and, the mouse and the elephant having the same number of heartbeats. You see the sort of nonlinear cause and effect stuff happen so rapidly. It's a model system in the sense that you gain a lot of insight into these things as they occur for you as an adult, but at a much slower time scale that you might find easier to or harder to notice.
Yeah, and that time scale that we observe as adults is really a bit of an illusion because it all starts with a time scale at the level of biomolecular activity within and in context of the cells, and that is, picoseconds and, incredibly fast things that are happening and changing and morphing, and yet somehow this process ends up in, the emergence of the cellular dynamics and the way the cells work together, and then the cell's actually part of this unique human being that is going through a developmental process as neurons are formed and connections are made, and things are learned and built into the system. So there's a fantastic and complex learning process that takes place in every organism, and particularly in every human being, that kind of baffles the imagination to contemplate. And yet, where it ends up with these, lovely individuals with deep social capacities and, joy and love and frustration and everything else that goes along with it, that blows the mind and takes the breath away in terms of what the actual reality that we're living in. So it probably makes sense to be open to what that might be about and where it might be going, because we certainly don't have all the answers, as you talked about in terms of the institutional dynamics or climate dynamics. We don't have all the answers, but we certainly have the responsibility, if we take our responsibility to these beautiful little ones and ourselves seriously, to try and do better, making choices, making decisions now, because we're recognizing the necessity of doing that, and we have to do it as best we can. And so that gets me back to the skepticism, the hard skepticism that we see so much of, which is really a form of denialism, or what the heck? Why am I going to worry about this thing that I can't make any sense of? It makes no sense, and 1,000 years ago, 200 years ago, it may have been that the society had a meta-narrative that people were largely buying into, that kind of helped organize, the standards and the guardrails about how people thought, how people made choices, how people behaved. A lot of it was baloney, but it at least those that succeeded in those narratives that succeeded in helping those societies and nations and cities and groups survive, thrive, expand, had to have some positive relationship with the world around them. It was an effective way of making those decisions, that meta-narrative that allowed people to kind of get organized, whether it was a theological organization or whether it was just the social organizations or power structures of city-states that allowed things to function more efficiently and make it through to what we now recognizes, the scientific revolution, the industrial age, all those fantastic, things that have delivered so much benefits. But, now we don't have that narrative that we can see. Science had that narrative, right? The mechanistic worldview and, everything fitting and determinism and cause and effect and all that beautiful mechanistic kind of approach to things. That's fallen apart. That's not working anymore. So, where do we go to try and shape those collective decisions that we're responsible for making to do a better job and go forward in a positive way? So that's kind of what the big question is. We've got a couple of things, stay open, be doubtful of your own knowledge, but not skeptical about everything else. And, so what else works?
Well, I mean, just to riff on your point here for a minute before I try to answer that question, I think about, Peter Turchin wrote that article on, do big societies need big gods? Because the great monotheistic religions seem to have emerged, in his view, as a way of organizing collective activity at the scale of these metropolitan, the emergent city-states.
Mm-hmm.
And, elsewhere, Dan Sperber and Mirta Galasic both have done research on, rationality and decision-making, and have made the point that, often social cohesion is more important than empirical, validity. That Galasic, when I interviewed her on Complexity episode 9, talked about how polling people about what they think their friends and family are going to do in an election is a more accurate census than polling people about what they think they themselves will do.
Right.
Because it turns out people are more than happy to change their minds at the last minute once they know, the quorum comes back and they know their friends are all going to vote for Trump, and they don't, it's more important that they stay in line with the social group upon which they're intimately interdependent, than it is for them to, and so you see this. I mean, this gets back to the question about the way that scientific decisions are pursued or ignored. Jeffrey Kripal, he wrote this book called The Flip, where he talked about how a lot of scientists turn out to have had some kind of mystical experience that called into question for them the basis of their convictions in material, in scientific materialism.
Yeah.
But they can't do anything about it. They can't say anything about it because they jeopardize their careers.
Right.
If they do.
And that's an interesting sidebar that I want to talk about in a little bit. But I wanted to get back to this idea that the social cohesion is more important than factual accuracy, and that big societies need big gods. Religion also provided something else. In addition to the sort of the cohesive organization, it also provided fundamental answers to questions that all humans are prone to ask. And so again, that is a way that society is not only organized in a way that was good for the society, but it also met those needs of those individuals. And now in a secular society where we've got the appeal to the head of science and rationality and those empirical values, where is the appeal to the heart? What is it that draws people from an empathic or social cohesion standpoint? What draws them into a way of thinking about the values and the epistemological basis of empirical science? What draws them into the heart? What's answering those big questions for them? And in the 20th century, I think the ability of science to answer those questions really fell apart. There was a sense that they could do it, and so scientists are now dealing with theological issues, and it's not answering the need of the society that has been created, that's come out of that. So we're displacing the needs that we have at the heart level with things like entertainment and diversions and distractions, and those are the things that we fill that emptiness with. So we need some way, from complexity science or theology or metaphysics or something, we need something to help human beings connect at the heart level with our explanations for how things work. And so now I wanted to ask you, because you are a musician, you're an artist, so these are the non-rational or pre-rational parts of making sense of things. And I just wanted to ask you about how that works for you. How do you what is it that you feel? Where do you go in your music or your art that has that sense of satisfaction and completion and connection, or maybe it doesn't?
Well, I mean, so I would interrogate that just a little bit, because I think, okay, so there's, first of all, I think that what we have lost in the modern era has more to do sort of with a function of church, or of these traditions, that isn't necessarily about the narrative per se. That is, as Alain de Botton has noted, that atheist churches still work. There's this great experiment going on in Europe, as I'm sure you know, of people realizing that the communitas provided by a weekly gathering is, in some respects, even more significant than the content that is explored in that structure. That there's something about living in the space with, regular encounters with, and the mesocosmic, the guilds and sports clubs and pubs and these things, and then that's actually what's been jeopardized, not through an effort to understand the world scientifically, but to operate on that understanding through the accidentally self-destructive pursuit of convenience and efficiency, through the erosion of the human sphere by economies of scale, by these the outsourcing of labor, that we're witnessing. Ultimately, I think I'm interviewing Parag Khanna here soon about his book Move, in which he, as an unabashed technocratic globalist, is making the argument for the opening of borders, because basically we're aging out as a society, that that birth rates are declining because the cost of living is going up as we become more and more urban, and so we're going to need people who can cross national borders in order to provide care for the elderly, and other other things that but things that like the work nobody wants to do, right? The building of houses, the farming of fruit, and so on. And that this is a constant point in the immigration debate, and I think he's right. But it's the at the same time, I am not at all a proponent of this sort of parochial nationalist thing, this spirit that has possessed so many people around the world,
or sports teams, or celebrity, blah, blah, or the monarchist, fascination, or the strongman fascination that we see in parts of the world. So those are all things that seem to be mistaken trajectories, from the past that we've inherited in the kind of world we live in now. How do we find a way to transcend those? The communitas, the community is great, but it tends to hold together and then oppose the we-they phenomenon that comes out of it. So anytime you're holding on to those limited sets of communities, without some sort of grand connecting sense, you're risking the retreat to tribalism and to a rejection of others and the xenophobia that goes along with it. And we're seeing that worldwide now. So people are identifying with their sports teams and their local communities and their in their cities and their nations, and then it becomes this stasis of entrenched, non-productive sets of relationships that isn't going anywhere. So if the community spirit and that sense of engagement at the personal level and the appeal to the heart is part of what people need to really make sense of their world, how do we take that to a point where it's a set of, say, global identifications as opposed to parochial identifications? So and from complexity science, we know effectively everything's connected to everything else. We now know that our DNA is in every other human on the face of the planet. So there are narratives about the connection with people across the globe that, can we migrate to those ways of making sense of things from a global perspective rather than being stuck with our local sports teams and our nation states and our strongman leaders and all the rest that seems to be so satisfying?
Well, I mean, it's again, it's complicated, right? Because on the one hand, I actually don't. I think that there's, again, another discrimination here between rooting for a sports team. Like I see people here in Santa Fe with Kansas City Chiefs hats on after the Chiefs win the Super Bowl, and it's like, well, I'm from Kansas City. Are you from Kansas City? No. It's like, so why did you, how have you been wrapped up into this? And with, again, like, strongman leader, it's like, I've never met this guy. I never will. He lives thousands of miles away from me. How did we get to a point where people feel, again, and I think it's, it's the displacement or the dislocation. People are still going to express this human urge for a localism or a regionalism, but it has been expropriated by these sort of more malevolent strains of governance at scale, where like William Irwin Thompson, like the great late historian I'm constantly referencing on Future Fossils, is was fond of calling it the military entertainment education industrial complex.
Yeah, that was thanks to Dwight Eisenhower, not to Dwight Eisenhower for his his farewell speech. Yeah.
But I mean, so that's but that includes Walt Disney as having replaced campfire storytelling and the story, the narrative in the nursery, and that includes the Green Bay Packers as a replacement for the sports team that you yourself are involved in, and I think that's the difference is that it's one thing for these this localism to be about actual stake, your your sense of place and of the participation mystique, and it's another thing for that desire to be commodified and sucked up into this large commercial engine. And so, at any rate, to your point, like, this is where the music and the art kind of comes back into it, because there are these things started out as ways of celebrating and performing these sort of cosmological and community oriented practices, these concerns and these worldviews. And I think it's actually really, I think I'm kind of like doomed to failure, commercial failure as an artist, because it's always been a matter of great personal interest to me to try and challenge the erection of the stage and the separation of the artist and the audience in my work. And people are not on that tip. Like,
it goes back to participation, right?
Right.
So music, art, performance was originally part of that community around the campfire. And then it became part of the religious expression of the people gathering together, and it became, a lot of it originated out of the religious impulses. I mean, if you look at what the Middle Ages created in terms of architecture and music, and its transformative qualities. So now you're pointing out that that's all been disengaged. It's now the commercialization of the artistic enterprise to, sell concert tickets. I mean, I don't want to diminish the work of the artists and musicians that are really striving to create messages and relate to their audience, but it's in a very different context, in a very different environment. And what seems potentially to be missing is that connection to the transcendent, the grand scale, the immensity of what we're all experiencing together. Because we don't have the performance. It's now an observer. We're passive observers of what's going on there. We're not participating, and it's been removed from that context. So, how do we reach back to the roots of music and art to fill the heart and connect us with creation and with the rest of humanity? Is there a way to do that?
Well, okay, so just a little bit of, personal history here, which is that for 13 years after college and before I started at the Santa Fe Institute, I was on festival circuit, primarily in the United States, but, some Australia and Europe and Canada and Costa Rica and so on. And I inhabited a world of so-called transformational festivals that were really striving to do what you're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
They were striving
Mm-hmm.
to use the festival not as merely a commercial container, but as a container for facilitating these transcendent experiences that people could then integrate in some way in the rest of their lives. Burning Man is a kind of textbook example of this, and the problems that Burning Man has had in this regard are, I think, emblematic of the greater problem, which is, well, for starters, so I have friends that are, still in that world and it's been a joy to watch them come up into, their sort of, relative measure of commercial success. And they have, it's like the Grateful Dead kind of thing. They have people that
Mm-hmm.
tour around following them.
Yeah.
And
A bit like a cult, a bit like a religion.
It is. It's kind of
okay.
a nomadic, cult of some kind. But it's at the same time, most of their fans are people that see the band maybe once or twice a year, and the rest
Mm-hmm.
of the time that they're just in their job in the house in the
Mm-hmm.
suburbs or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And it's the friends of mine that are familiar with that world. It's a painful world to live in because you miss so many people all the time. You've made friends that live all over the world, and you cannot see them most of the time. And so your community, just as, in the effort to sort of reconnect everything that has been torn asunder by these processes we're discussing, the closest relationships that you have are with people hundreds or thousands of miles away from you.
Yeah.
And so I don't, it's not that this stuff is not functioning in a way that you and I are describing. It is in fact reconnecting people to whatever you might call the sacred. It is giving people a sense of participation in community, but it's not providing, I know around maybe 2013 or 14, people started getting really fed up they're like, wait a minute, we're just, this is not doing what it's supposed to do. This festival environment is not giving people, most of these places are venues that have to be rented, and it's not even guaranteed the festival is going to be on the same site next year.
Yeah.
And so the infrastructure is constantly being re-erected and then torn down.
Yeah.
And there's nothing, you're not working towards anything that is building on itself incrementally ultimately, and the commercial concerns around the festival are such that I'd worked the same event for 5 years, and then they would decide that, no, we don't actually, now that you have a bunch of people that want to see you play at this festival, we're actually going to go with someone else because we need to keep refreshing it with new acts. Yeah. And so,
think of that, contrast that with, for example, what Athens did in terms of building the theater, and the culture that was behind that and that knitted it together, or the Colosseum in Rome, which is a different animal entirely, but without that. Without those constructs, it's just a give and take. By the way, I attended Woodstock in 1969.
Oh yeah.
So talk about festivals. Very interesting. We can kind of talk about our observations, a festival life. But what you're pointing out is that this movement is kind of disconnected from the underpinnings of a supportive culture and society that values that, not just in terms of monetary terms, because are we in a society where everything's boiled down to monetary terms, and that's going to miss so much. It misses most of the heart connections that people might have with things, and yet we don't have an infrastructure which can help sustain that, at least at this point. One of the questions is whether we have lots of areas where people are kind of exploring alternative ways of making those connections, coming back again to something that connects, the head, the heart, the creative impulse, the community spirit, in a way that can, transcend those boundaries in some sense. And, we have technology now allows, we're 3,000 miles apart, and here we are having a wonderful conversation, and, I consider you a friend. We've got this connection. So maybe there are ways that, some of that can kind of begin bubbling up out of the sense of dissatisfaction that people have, that maybe can stimulate these kinds of things to start having more than just nominal commercial success.
So there's, I watch Star Trek. I'm quite a fan of that franchise. And I think it's been interesting to watch over the last 10 years, especially, how the utopian vision of Star Trek has been interrogated, has been challenged in some of the latest series that they've put out, particularly in Discovery and Picard. Although it really started with like Deep Space Nine and the surfacing of the concerns of the oppressed and of minorities in this sort of exalted view of the Federation, the Roddenberry vision for what a sort of a secular humanism, post-capitalist space civilization would look like. And a lot of people have taken issue with that, that it's popping their bubble, But I think it's beautiful because, like when we talk about how do you reconcile the celebration of and the need for diversity with these more sweeping and kind of inclusive values or virtues. It seems like what Star Trek is saying is that it takes faster than light travel, whether that's through the transporter technology or whether it's through, the warp drive, that you can't even really begin to assault xenophobia. And that's, ultimately that story is about the incremental assault of xenophobia, like the Klingons start out as enemies, and then you have one working on the bridge of the Enterprise, and then you move on to the Romulans, and the Romulans end up getting folded into us. And then, even more lately, it's like the Borg. Like suddenly, we can even talk about the Borg possibly being, an ally rather than a purely evil foe other. And but at the same time, like, I wonder about that because we're learning both about if we're going to take everything we've said about, the inadequacy of models and apply it to real sort of geopolitical concerns, we realize now that both in some sense, in the sense of like nuclear fallout reigns all over the planet, that borders are not what we thought they were, and they cannot be defended in the way that we used to think they could be. But also that when you connect everything to everything else, the whole enterprise becomes so much more fragile and vulnerable, and so we do need to enforce boundaries of some kind, even if we understand on some level that those boundaries are constructions or that they are, transitory. And so, like, I wonder about, the degree to which, a transporter network or, faster than light travel and, these things that are exalted as a solution in Star Trek remind me again of, the like Amazon.com or email or these other things that are so erosive to whether it's, the ecological or the cognitive and attentional underpinnings of the human scale. And so I don't know. I mean, I'm not. You keep asking me these questions, and I'm like, look, all I can do for you, and this is sort of true of the way that complex system science seems to be practiced at SFI is they're like, we're not here to give you answers. What we're here to do is to give you ways of thinking about how to face these wicked problems a little bit more cogently. And we're here to give you constraints and say these are the limits within which you can make a decision, but we can't tell you what decision to make ultimately. And so again, like, just as an artist, I live within the sort of the bumpers of wanting my work to connect people, wanting it to challenge the dissociation of the artist in the audience, but at the same time recognizing that a lot of people are deeply uncomfortable with that. I ran a residency for over 2 years in Austin where I would bring people up from the audience, non-musicians, and loop them and remix their random noises into something approximating music, and yet I'm even as I'm demystifying the process of live music production, I'm also using technologies that are expensive and hard to learn, and so there's this kind of fan dance between the interest that people have in mystique and the interest that people have in participation, and I haven't found even night to night, the balance between those two things has to be sort of reinvented.
And so there's some aspects of these efforts that are affirming and positive, and yet there's also uncertainties and dissatisfaction. It's kind of like the ambivalence of both aspects of it. Not, and I feel the same way, for example, about children. They're my grandchildren up over my shoulder. There are 9 of them, and great joy and great anxiety in the same instant. So we're in this ambivalent phase, and perhaps in this modern post scientific realism, post-world, we have to be aware of the ambivalence. This goes back to maybe the Zen concepts of, kind of at the same time, both sides of the yin and the yang are present in the exact moment. So we have to be able to get comfortable with that ambivalence in a way that very, very, humans don't like that ambivalence. It's, we want clear answers, simple answers, give it to me straight, don't, and yet that's inconsistent with the kind of world that we're seeing emerge out of the science that comes from complexity science. So we've got to be kind of get used to that, some of that ambivalence, and learn how to deal with it, maybe the way the Zen masters do. And I wanted to ask you a question about the SFI environment. Clearly, complexity science was out of the sphere of conventional science for a period of time. It was kind of on the edge. And as a matter of fact, I did some work on E.O. Wilson's book, Consilience, which is a wonderful, wonderful book. I love that book. Dan Sanderson and I put together a podcast series on that book. And it was great, but he dissed complexity science as, kind of a bunch of offbeat guys, not really having any, coherent ability to draw together, which is what he was talking about in that book. So they were kind of outside the fold, and I wanted to ask you about, that community. Does SFI, have a sense of community? And obviously they've got people now from all over the world that have attended sessions or been part of that, and now they're, is there a diaspora or a global sense of something coming out of the SFI in terms of its culture and what it feels like to be part of the SFI?
I mean, there is, but at the same time, my work in communications there, not as a scientific researcher, but as an interlocutor. I don't think that there was really, because that place is structured as a kind of scientific monastery, and its cloistering is so crucial to the work that the space that it's providing for people to come together in these cross-disciplinary or non-disciplinary collaborations. They are in some sense challenged by their own success, by the growing acceptance of the importance of complex systems thinking, because in a way they've become kind of like a pilgrimage site for this growing body of complex systems enthusiasts, both academic and non-academic. And they cannot possibly, it's the same as like you opening your email. Like there's no way to keep up with the attention that is now being demanded of you.
Yeah.
And so it's been, it's part of my work has been to try and help them understand and permit and attend to a kind of tent city of pilgrims that has, historically not been recognized as their responsibility, I guess. And this is true of a lot of, this is not unique to them. It is always a challenge, I think, as a musical act or anyone who it's very hard for us to understand what popularity means until you are already besieged by the paparazzi. All of us want, I think, on some level, enough attention to muster the resources that we need in order to achieve the things we want in our life. But the cost of that is that you can lose the spontaneity
and freedom that allowed you to do what you did then starts to become constrained.
The question of to what degree you're answerable to your audience, if you're like Radiohead or whatever, is like, and they've done a very good job, I think, pursuing their own.
Radiohead or SFI?
Oh, Radiohead. I mean, both of them, I think, have done a great job of keeping their ethos, their identity,
Yeah.
and and their maverick nature intact.
Yeah.
But I mean, it is always, and again, to get back to this issue of how science is conducted, even if you're not taking donations that determine the nature, the course of scientific research, then there's still.
Or you're at an academy. You're still on a payroll. So
that you're, that they still, at this point now, originally they had something to prove, and now they have a title to maintain.
Yeah.
And so, the maintenance of prestige has its own costs, and it's very much like the way that an organism grows. At first, all of us are very playful, and then we become more. The bigger you are, the harder you fall, right? So you take fewer and fewer risks as you get older, because you're aware that falling over and breaking a hip can kill you at some point.
But at a certain point, the older you get, you can say, "Oh, what the heck? I'll just take those risks." Right?
And the oldest scientists, the people like Jeffrey West at SFI are far more comfortable entertaining weird ideas than the people that are still trying to earn tenure or find a faculty appointment or these kinds of things.
One of my personal favorites is Roger Penrose, who is he's beyond boundaries. He's beyond that point. There's a metaphor about the fact that the monasteries of the Middle Ages, and this is from Joseph Heinrich's work at Harvard. The monasteries created an environment which allowed sort of an evolution of what then became the academies. There were a lot of other things going on, in that time period as well, and that was the seedbed from which the Reformation, the Enlightenment, the scientific revolution emerged. So here's a positive way of thinking about Santa Fe Institute and its problems is, maybe this is going to be the seedbed for the more effective and positive way of organizing the world and our response to complex system dynamics, complex adaptive systems, which of course we're living in on all multi-scale levels, to be able to view that in a way that helps us understand and synthesize and become part of what will be the 22nd century, ethos world, and achieving things for humanity that we can hardly even imagine today, given the problems we're facing. Yeah, think that's a way of thinking about it.
More broadly speaking, again, Bill Thompson, in his founding of the Lindisfarne Association, which was this interdisciplinary think tank for the immanentization of planetary culture that he started back in the 1970s after rage quitting at MIT. And that included people like, Lindisfarne included people like Stuart Brand and E.F. Schumacher and Lynn Margulis and, Stu Kaufman and, they were instrumental in the founding of the Mind and Life Institute and the foundations of neurotheology and so on. They, Danilo Meadows, all these people. Their roster is a who's who list of influential systems thinkers, Greg Bateson. They understood that exactly what you're saying, that there was something about the preservation of culture through these interregnum periods where the Vikings come and they storm, the monasteries and so on. There's another way to think about it, which is that I think, based on work like that of my friend Bruce Damer and his mentor Dave Deemer at the University of California, Santa Cruz, on the origins of life, I think they're making a very, very strong case now that life must have, as Darwin originally imagined, started in geothermal ponds, rather than in the open ocean, rather than around these deep sea thermal vents, because the water is a solvent, and in a large enough body of water, you cannot create a container for these intricate chemical reactions to unfold, and so it has to happen in a smaller body. It has to happen in
little pools and puddles.
Right.
That go
Real
dry,
cultural
wet, dry,
innovation
wet, dry,
happens
wet.
on islands. So there is actually a problem on some level with the project of consilience, as E.O. Wilson imagines it, which is that, as I've talked about with Simon DeDeo on episode 72 of Complexity, consilience, this idea of explaining everything at once, is in tension with a different heuristic for what constitutes a satisfying simple explanation. And that, consilience, as practiced by revolutionary physicists like James Clerk Maxwell in, a theory of electromagnetism, is essentially a conspiracy theory between electricity and magnetism. It's, realizing that these things have a hidden unification.
Right. It's a Hegelian dialectic. It's a Zen unification of opposing parts that are part of the same whole.
Yeah, but if you don't have, a check in place by people that want rather the simplest, like write it on a T-shirt explanation, even if it leaves out other phenomena that cannot be explained.
Right.
Then you end up with this sort of, what is pejoratively called conspiracy theory.
Yeah.
Where, you're not actually applying a kind of like a principle of parsimony. And so, to think about it like as you're alluding to this idea that, these two ways of coming to an explanation resemble the drive toward a more sort of introspective or locally focused kind of community operation versus a much more globalist or universalist, which is a more consilient enterprise ultimately.
Yeah.
But of course, like in so doing, you lose the efficiency, as I talked about with Tyson Yunkaporta in I think 172 of Future Fossils. Tyson, coming from the Appalachian clan in the unceded lands of Australia, that this is, we talked about, the way that fair hiring practices in the modern world require an open call, but then you spend months trying to hire the right person when you knew the whole time that the right person was like your cousin or something. And, and so there's this tension again between, in a different way, the efficiencies involved in, what is this effectively like, cronyism.
Yeah.
Versus the efficiencies, the different kinds of efficiencies and virtues involved in the way that the modern world regards fairness and like the execution of fairness.
Right.
And so again, like we're getting back to this thing about like, well, what looks fair at the level of the state is not necessarily like what looks fair to the level of
the individual,
the communities that comprise that state, or the individuals that comprise those communities. And this is not, as my view, this is not soluble. This is a tension that is, irreducible and in fact necessary. Otherwise we collapse into some sort of, myopic thinking that then becomes vulnerable to endogenous or exogenous disruption. And so we want.
So it sounds like one of the things one of the takeaways is that we need to be able to be comfortable with ambivalence, and we need to be able to be comfortable with tension. These are part of the way dynamic systems work and evolve and adapt, and so we just need to be comfortable with those and not necessarily always jump to the fixed result, the simple answer, the best. This is the blah blah blah. We need to be comfortable. Ambivalence, uncertainty, the dynamic tension, or the conflicts, the tensions of conflict. Michael, this has been spectacularly fun, and I really, really enjoyed it. I have one final question for you. would you have any example in your own history of what you characterize as a personal transcendent experience, unexplainable, mystical, something that was really important in the shaping of who you are, and it just was something you experienced and don't necessarily have a good explanation for?
I mean, yeah. I mean, I've got lots of those. I have told this story a few times on, Future Fossils and other shows. If you go back to 185, I give a fairly thorough recounting of a series of UFO encounters I had in 2006 and 7 that I think almost systematically challenged me in the way that my friend Stuart Davis calls, he says, I think the ontological shock of the UFO phenomenon seems to be just an essential part of it, if not like, if in fact this is the work of, an inscrutable other, an intelligence of some kind, then it seems that what it is trying to do is to forbid us from making any kind of sense of it, as a developmental catalyst, as a call into the transrational, because we can't reasonably ignore these phenomena. At the same time, we are constantly deprived of any satisfying explanation for them.
Yeah. Was this in New Mexico?
No, this was in Kansas.
Kansas, yeah. So it's interesting that I think there was a report recently within the last year from whether it was DOD or NASA, I'm sure, that affirmed that these just can't be explained. Mm-hmm. Many of them they cannot be explained either under known science or anything. There's just no explanation. So I think you're on firm footing for having identified that as one of those mysteries that cannot be categorized or answered or explained, and yet they are something that that have happened.
I recently posted a series of slides to my Patreon that they're publicly available, that were from my contribution to a larger presentation for the Diverse Intelligences Summer Institute last year, where I was, what we were trying to do together was provide an argument that the search filters used by astrobiologists are too narrow, and that that we need to be much humbler about the criteria by which we look for non-human intelligence, and I mean that would go into more detail here than we have time for.
Yeah, so I think we'll stop right there, because I think that the humbler aspect or the humility aspect, we talked about a couple of things that that we ought to hold on to as we go down this road, and humility is I think one of those key virtues to be able to keep us from running off the rails and or over-interpreting or under-interpreting or denial or whatever it is. Michael, this has been fantastic. I really appreciate your time and your contributions. I urge everybody to listen to your podcast at the SFI Complexity podcast or Future Fossils podcast, and the music and art that you have out there. It's really great. It's great to meet you. Great to spend time, and I think we're going to have to come back at some point because there are too many loose ends to follow up on.
Thanks, George.
Thanks for joining us on this episode of Making Sense of Complexity. Next episode, I will be joined by Blue Knight, an independent consultant with broad experience in neurobiology, predictive analytics, bioinformatics, yoga, meditation, and art. A co-organizer of the Complexity Weekend and the Active Inference Lab, Blue seeks to integrate her broad range of experience and interests into a balanced life. In the meantime, please explore the websites of our collaborators Complexity Weekend, Planksip, and Talk of Today, and join the conversation on our social media outlets or on spiralinquiry.org. Stay well and have a great week.